The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Sarah Martinez adjusted her police badge one last time before stepping out of her patrol car. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most fearless officers in the city. Her colleagues often joked that she had a sixth sense for danger, always seeming to arrive at the right place at the right time. Sarah's weapon had never failed her. In her 5 years on the force, she had successfully defended 23 people from various threats. Bank robberies, domestic violence situations, armed assaults. She had seen it all and emerged victorious every time. The local newspaper had even dubbed her the Guardian Angel of Pine Valley, a title that made her both proud and uncomfortable. What people didn't know was that Sarah carried a secret that weighed heavier than her service weapon. Every morning she would stare at herself in the mirror, wondering if today would be the day her past caught up with her. The confident officer everyone saw was built on a foundation of lies, and she knew that one day, the truth would surface. As she walked toward the community center where she was scheduled to give a safety presentation to local teenagers, Sarah noticed a commotion near the parking lot. A group of young men had surrounded an elderly woman, their voices growing louder and more aggressive. Mrs. Chen, the sweet Korean grandmother who ran the flower shop downtown, clutched her purse tightly as the men demanded her money. Without hesitation, Sarah's training kicked in. She approached the scene with measured steps, her hand resting casually on her weapon. The men noticed her uniform and began to scatter, but Sarah called out firmly, asking them to stop. Her reputation preceded her. Even the troublemakers in Pine Valley knew better than to challenge Officer Martinez. The leader of the group, a young man with tattoos covering his arms, turned to face her with a defiant sneer. He pulled out a knife, waving it threateningly in Mrs. Chen's direction. The elderly woman whimpered, pressing herself against a parked car. Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, and it reminded her of another pair of frightened eyes from long ago, eyes that still haunted her dreams. Sarah drew her weapon smoothly, her voice steady and authoritative as she ordered the man to drop the knife. The other young men had already fled, leaving their leader alone to face the consequences of his actions. For a moment, time seemed frozen as the two faced each other in the morning sunlight. The man's resolve began to crumble under Sarah's unwavering gaze. She had perfected this technique over the years, projecting absolute confidence even when her heart was racing. Her weapon remained steady, pointed at the ground but ready to be raised if necessary. She knew that in most situations, the mere presence of her gun and her reputation was enough to defuse the threat. Mrs. Chen watched in amazement as the young man slowly lowered his knife. Sarah continued to speak in calm, measured tones, explaining the consequences of his actions and offering him a chance to walk away without charges if he cooperated. It was a technique she had learned not from police academy textbooks, but from years of navigating dangerous situations through a combination of authority and compassion. The knife clattered to the ground, and the man raised his hands in surrender. Sarah quickly secured the weapon while keeping her gun trained on the suspect. She radioed for backup, though she suspected she wouldn't need it. This was case number 23, another successful intervention that would add to her growing legend. As backup arrived and took the suspect into custody, Mrs. Chen approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. She grasped the officer's hands, speaking rapidly in broken English about how grateful she was. Sarah felt the familiar mix of pride and guilt that accompanied each of her victories. The community saw her as a hero, but she knew the truth about where her skills really came from. Walking back to her patrol car, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. She had spent years running from her past, only to find herself in a career that put her in constant danger. Her weapon had saved 23 people, but it had also saved her from having to confront the darkness that lurked in her own history. The radio crackled to life, dispatching her to another call across town. Sarah sighed, knowing that each successful case brought her closer to the inevitable moment when someone would start asking questions about her background. Her stellar record was both her greatest achievement and her biggest liability, drawing attention she couldn't afford. As she drove through the familiar streets of Pine Valley, Sarah wondered how much longer she could maintain the carefully constructed life she had built. The community trusted her completely, her fellow officers respected her, and her superiors were considering her for a promotion. Everything was perfect on the surface, but perfection built on deception was fragile. The call turned out to be a false alarm, giving Sarah time to think as she patrolled the quiet neighborhoods. She had chosen this profession not out of some noble calling to serve and protect, but because it offered her the perfect cover. Who would suspect that someone dedicated to upholding the law might be hiding from it? Her phone buzzed with a text message from her partner, asking if she wanted to grab lunch after their shift. Sarah smiled, thinking about how normal her life appeared to everyone around her. She had friends, a career she excelled at, and the respect of her community. It was everything she had never thought she could have, built on a foundation of carefully guarded secrets. But as she typed her response, accepting the lunch invitation, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her time was running out. 23 successful cases had made her famous in Pine Valley, and fame was the last thing someone with her past could afford. The very success that made her proud was also the thing that would ultimately expose her. The afternoon sun climbed higher as Sarah continued her patrol, unaware that forces beyond her control were already in motion, forces that would soon bring her carefully constructed world crashing down around her. 3 weeks after the incident with Mrs. Chen, Sarah found herself facing her most challenging case yet. A domestic violence call had come in from the upscale Maple Ridge neighborhood, where disputes were usually settled behind closed doors, and police involvement was rare. As she pulled up to the large colonial house, she could hear shouting and the sound of breaking glass from inside. Sarah's partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, met her at the front door. Mike had been on the force for 15 years and had seen everything, but even he looked concerned as they approached the house. Through the front window, they could see a man holding a baseball bat while a woman and 2 small children cowered behind a couch. The situation required delicate handling. Sarah knew from experience that domestic violence cases were among the most dangerous for police officers. Emotions ran high, and perpetrators often turned their violence toward anyone who tried to intervene. Her weapon would need to remain holstered unless absolutely necessary, but she needed to be ready to draw it at a moment's notice. Mike positioned himself at the back door while Sarah approached the front. She knocked firmly, identifying herself as police and demanding entry. The shouting inside stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She had learned to trust her instincts in these situations, and right now, they were telling her that something was very wrong. The door opened slowly to reveal a tall man with wild eyes and scratches on his face. Behind him, Sarah could see overturned furniture and broken picture frames scattered across the floor. The man claimed everything was fine, that it had just been a misunderstanding, but Sarah could see the terror in the woman's eyes as she peered around the corner. Sarah's training told her to proceed cautiously, but her instincts screamed danger. The man's hand kept moving toward his waistband, and she noticed a kitchen knife lying on the coffee table within his reach. This was exactly the type of situation where her reputation for being unshakable under pressure had been built, but today felt different somehow. As she tried to convince the man to step outside and talk, Sarah caught a glimpse of one of the children, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child's frightened face triggered a memory that Sarah had spent years trying to suppress. Suddenly, she wasn't Officer Martinez anymore. She was 8-year-old Sarah Thompson, hiding behind a similar couch while her own father raged through their house. The man lunged for the knife, and Sarah's muscle memory took over. Her weapon appeared in her hands as if by magic, trained on the threat with deadly precision. Her voice remained calm and professional as she ordered him to stop. But inside, her heart was pounding with emotions she had buried long ago. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. The man realized he was outmatched and slowly raised his hands. Sarah kept her weapon trained on him while Mike entered through the back door to secure the scene. The woman and children were safely evacuated, and the man was arrested without further incident. Case number 24 had ended successfully, but something had changed in Sarah during those crucial moments. The little girl's face had awakened memories she had spent her entire adult life trying to forget. As she filled out the incident report, her hands trembled slightly, something that had never happened before. Mike noticed her unusual behavior, but attributed it to the stress of the situation. He complimented her on another textbook intervention, unaware that his partner was fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with the case they had just closed. Sarah managed a weak smile and finished her paperwork. eager to get home and try to push the memories back into the dark corners of her mind where they belonged. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, staring at her service weapon on the kitchen table. 24 people now owed their safety to her quick thinking and steady hand, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was finally catching up with her. The little girl's face had been a stark reminder of why she had become so good at handling dangerous situations. She had learned early in life that survival sometimes depended on knowing when violence was necessary. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding thoughts. The caller ID showed her supervisor's name, and Sarah's blood went cold. Captain Williams never called officers at home unless there was a serious problem. With trembling fingers, she answered the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. The captain's voice was formal and businesslike as he asked Sarah to come in early the next morning for a meeting. He wouldn't say what it was about, only that there were some questions about her background check that needed to be clarified. Sarah's carefully constructed world suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. After hanging up, Sarah paced her small apartment like a caged animal. She had always known this day might come, but she had hoped her excellent record would buy her more time. 24 successful cases should have been enough to prove her worth to the department, but apparently, someone had started digging into her past. Sarah pulled out a small box from her bedroom closet, a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the remnants of her old life. A different name, different documents, and photographs of people she had tried to forget. The top photo showed a much younger Sarah standing next to a man who looked exactly like the domestic violence perpetrator from earlier that day. Her father had the same wild eyes, the same capacity for violence that had defined her childhood. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become a police officer to escape her past, but that past had given her the skills that made her so effective at her job. Every successful case had been built on lessons learned during the darkest period of her life. Her weapon had saved 24 people, but it had also been her shield against a truth she wasn't ready to face. As the night wore on, Sarah considered her options. She could run again, disappear into another identity and start over in a different city. She had done it before, and she had the resources to do it again. But for the first time in her life, she had something worth fighting for. Pine Valley had become her home, and the people she protected had become her family. The meeting with Captain Williams would determine her future. Sarah spent the rest of the night preparing for questions she hoped would never come, practicing answers to inquiries about gaps in her employment history and discrepancies in her background. Her entire career hung in the balance, and she knew that one wrong answer could destroy everything she had built. As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of running, she would face whatever consequences awaited her. 24 people were alive because of her actions, and maybe that would be enough to outweigh the sins of her past. She holstered her weapon one more time, not knowing if she would ever wear the badge again. The drive to the police station felt like a funeral march. Sarah looked at the familiar streets of Pine Valley, wondering if this would be the last time she would see them as Officer Martinez. The community that had embraced her as their guardian angel was about to learn that their hero had been living a lie. Walking into the station, Sarah noticed that her colleagues were avoiding eye contact. Word traveled fast in a small police department, and it was clear that everyone knew something was happening. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward Captain Williams' office, ready to face whatever truth was waiting for her behind that door. Captain Williams's office felt smaller than usual as Sarah sat across from his desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The captain was a fair man who had always supported her, but his expression was unreadable as he shuffled through a thick file folder. Sarah noticed her name on the tab, though she was certain it contained information she had hoped would never surface. The silence stretched between them before Captain Williams finally spoke. A routine background check for her upcoming promotion had revealed some inconsistencies in her employment history. There were gaps in her timeline that didn't match her original application, and her references from her previous job couldn't be verified. The captain's voice remained professional, but Sarah could hear the disappointment underneath. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to formulate an explanation that wouldn't be an outright lie. She had prepared for this moment for years, but now that it was here, all her rehearsed answers seemed inadequate. The truth was too dangerous to tell, But continuing to lie felt impossible when faced with the man who had trusted and mentored her. Before she could respond, the captain's phone rang with an emergency dispatch. There was an active shooter situation at Pine Valley Elementary School, and all available units were being called to respond. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she realized her own struggles would have to wait. Children were in danger, and that took precedence over everything else. Captain Williams looked at Sarah with conflict in his eyes. Protocol dictated that an officer under investigation should be suspended pending resolution of the inquiry. But Pine Valley was a small department, and they needed every trained officer available. After a moment's hesitation, he made a decision that would change everything. Sarah was cleared to respond to the emergency, but this would be her final case as Officer Martinez. Win or lose, her career in Pine Valley would end when the school situation was resolved. The captain handed her the file folder, telling her to read it when she had time and be prepared to answer questions when she returned. Racing toward the elementary school with sirens blaring, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. This would be case number 25 and potentially her last chance to make a difference. The file folder sat on her passenger seat like a ticking time bomb, but she pushed all thoughts of her own problems aside. Right now, innocent children needed her protection. The scene at Pine Valley Elementary was chaos. Parents had gathered behind police barriers, frantically searching for information about their children. Sarah could see the terror in their faces, and it reminded her of her own childhood fears. She had spent years running from violence, only to dedicate her life to standing between it and innocent people. The tactical team was still en route, but reports indicated that the shooter was barricaded in the school library, with at least a dozen children trapped inside. Sarah knew that in situations like this, every second counted. Children were dying while they waited for backup that might not arrive in time. Against protocol, Sarah made a decision that would define her legacy. She couldn't wait for the tactical team while children were in immediate danger. Her weapon had saved 24 people, and she was determined to add more names to that list. She approached the school building through the back entrance, using skills she had learned long before she ever wore a police uniform. Moving through the empty hallways, Sarah could hear crying and shouting coming from the direction of the library. Her heart pounded as she remembered her own childhood trauma, but she used that pain as fuel for her determination. Every frightened child's voice reminded her of why she had chosen this path, despite the personal cost. As she approached the library, Sarah could see the shooter through the glass doors. He was a young man, probably no older than 20, pacing back and forth with an assault rifle while children huddled behind overturned tables. The scene was heartbreakingly familiar to Sarah, echoing memories of her own father's violent outbursts. The shooter was clearly unstable, shouting about grievances against the school system and society in general. Sarah recognized the signs of someone who felt cornered and desperate, emotions she understood all too well. Her training told her to wait for backup, but her instincts said that these children didn't have time for protocol. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed open the library doors. Her weapon was drawn but lowered as she called out to the shooter, identifying herself and asking to talk. The young man spun around in surprise, his rifle trained on her, but Sarah didn't flinch. She had faced down armed criminals before, but never with so much at stake. What happened next would be debated for years afterward. Sarah began talking to the shooter in a calm, steady voice. But her words weren't standard police negotiation tactics. Instead, she spoke about pain and anger, about feeling trapped and misunderstood, about the cycle of violence that destroys both victims and perpetrators. Her voice carried a conviction that came from personal experience. The shooter's grip on his rifle began to loosen as Sarah continued talking. She slowly moved closer, her own weapon still pointed at the ground, showing trust even in the face of mortal danger. The children watched in terrified silence as their potential savior appeared to be taking an enormous risk. Sarah could see confusion in the young man's eyes as her words penetrated his rage. She spoke about second chances and the possibility of choosing a different path, even when everything seemed hopeless. Her own voice nearly broke as she talked about the weight of past mistakes and the courage it took to face the consequences of one's actions. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah's colleagues had surrounded the building, but they held back, recognizing that their intervention might escalate the situation. Through the windows, they watched as Officer Martinez performed what would later be called a miracle of negotiation. Finally, The rifle fell from the shooter's hands, clattering to the floor as he collapsed in tears. Sarah quickly secured the weapon while other officers rushed in to evacuate the children. Not a single shot had been fired, and 24 young lives had been saved through words rather than violence. It was case number 25, and it would be remembered as Sarah's greatest triumph. As the children were reunited with their parents outside, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. She had saved 25 groups of people during her career, using skills learned from the darkest chapters of her own life. The irony wasn't lost on her that her final case involved the same type of family violence that had shaped her childhood. Captain Williams approached her as she watched the emotional reunions taking place in the school parking lot. The file folder was still tucked under his arm, but his expression had changed completely. What he had witnessed that day had convinced him that Officer Martinez, whoever she really was, belonged exactly where she was. The captain handed Sarah the unopened file folder, telling her that some questions didn't need answers. Her 25 successful cases spoke louder than any background check ever could. Pine Valley needed officers like her, regardless of what secrets she might be carrying from her past. But Sarah knew that her story was far from over. The confrontation in the library had forced her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding for years. Her dark past had given her the tools to save lives, but it was time to stop running from who she really was. The file folder in her hands contained the key to understanding not just her history, but her future. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment with the unopened file folder on her coffee table. Captain Williams had given her a choice. She could return the file unread and continue her career without questions, or she could open it and face whatever truth lay inside. The elementary school incident had earned her a commendation and solidified her reputation as Pine Valley's finest officer. But Sarah knew she couldn't move forward without confronting her past. The folder felt heavy in her hands as she finally broke the seal. Inside were photographs, police reports, and newspaper clippings that told the story of Sarah Thompson, a story she had spent 15 years trying to forget. The first photograph showed a modest house on the wrong side of town, the kind of neighborhood where police sirens were a nightly soundtrack and broken dreams littered the streets like autumn leaves. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at a picture of herself at age 8, standing next to a woman with tired eyes and bruised arms. Her mother, Linda Thompson, had been beautiful once, but years of abuse had worn her down to a shadow of her former self. Sarah could still remember the smell of her mother's perfume mixed with the metallic scent of blood that had become too familiar in their household. The police reports painted a picture of escalating domestic violence that had gone on for years. Call after call to the Thompson residence, each one documenting another incident of rage and terror. Sarah's father, Marcus Thompson, had been a man consumed by anger and alcohol, taking out his frustrations on the two people who loved him most. As Sarah read through the reports, she began to understand how she had developed her uncanny ability to read dangerous situations. Living with Marcus Thompson had been like walking through a minefield every day, never knowing what small action might trigger an explosion of violence. She had learned to read the subtle signs of escalating tension, to position herself strategically, and to think quickly under pressure. One report from when Sarah was 10 years old described a particularly violent incident where Marcus had threatened both his wife and daughter with a hunting rifle. The responding officers had noted that young Sarah Thompson had shown remarkable composure for a child her age, even helping to calm her hysterical mother after her father was arrested. The seeds of her future career had been planted in those terrifying moments. The most difficult document to read was the final police report, the one that had changed everything. Sarah remembered that night with crystal clarity, even though she had tried to bury the memories for so many years. She had been 14, home alone with her mother while her father was supposed to be at work. But Marcus had come home early, drunk and angrier than she had ever seen him. According to the report, neighbors had called police after hearing gunshots from the Thompson residence. When officers arrived, they found Marcus Thompson dead from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Linda Thompson was in critical condition with multiple injuries, and 14-year-old Sarah was found holding the hunting rifle, her clothes covered in blood. The investigation had been thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Sarah had claimed self-defense, stating that her father was going to kill her mother and then turn the gun on her. The physical evidence supported her story. Linda's injuries were severe, and Marcus had been found with his hands around her throat. The district attorney had ruled it a justified shooting, but the damage to Sarah's psyche was irreversible. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the weight of that hunting rifle in her small hands. She had fired to save her mother's life, but Linda Thompson had died 3 days later from her injuries. At 14, Sarah had become an orphan whose only family was the state. The system had failed to protect her mother from years of abuse, and in the end, a child had been forced to take a life to try to save one. The rest of the file detailed Sarah's time in foster care and her eventual aging out of the system at 18. She had changed her name legally from Thompson to Martinez, moved across the country, and worked various jobs while putting herself through community college. Her criminal justice degree had been earned with one goal in mind: to become the kind of officer who could protect people the way no one had protected her family. Now, the truth about her 25 successful cases became clear. Sarah hadn't just been lucky or naturally gifted at handling dangerous situations. She had been shaped by violence from an early age, forced to learn survival skills that translated perfectly to police work. Her steady hand with a weapon came from muscle memory developed during the most traumatic experience of her life. The irony was overwhelming. Sarah had become a police officer to escape her violent past, but that past was the very thing that made her so effective at her job. Every life she had saved was connected to that terrible night when she had taken her first life to save the 2 people she loved most. Her weapon had become both her burden and her redemption. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah quickly closed the file folder and opened the door to find Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman she had saved weeks earlier. The kind grandmother was carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a bright smile that made Sarah's heart ache with guilt. Mrs. Chen spoke in her broken English about how grateful she was for Sarah's protection and how safe the community felt knowing she was watching over them. She called Sarah an angel sent from heaven, unaware that the woman she was thanking had blood on her hands from decades ago. The cookies were still warm, made with love and gratitude that Sarah felt unworthy to receive. After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah sat with the cookies untouched, staring at the file folder that contained her entire history. She had spent years building a reputation as Pine Valley's guardian angel, but the truth was far more complicated. Her gift for protecting others had come at a terrible price, and she wasn't sure she deserved the community's trust and admiration. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mike Rodriguez, asking if she wanted to grab dinner and celebrate her commendation from the school incident. Sarah stared at the message, realizing that her partner and friend had no idea who she really was. Mike saw her as a hero, a role model, and a trusted colleague. How would he react if he knew that her first use of a weapon had been to kill her own father? Sarah walked to her bedroom and pulled out the small box of mementos from her old life. Next to the photos and documents was something she hadn't looked at in years, a letter her mother had written to her shortly before the final confrontation with Marcus. Linda Thompson had somehow known that their situation was escalating toward a deadly conclusion, and she had wanted her daughter to understand that whatever happened, it wouldn't be her fault. The letter was written in her mother's careful handwriting, every word chosen with love and desperation. Linda had told Sarah that she was proud of her strength and courage, and that sometimes good people were forced to make impossible choices. She had asked Sarah to forgive herself for whatever the future might bring, and to use her experiences to help others who couldn't help themselves. Reading her mother's words after all these years, Sarah finally understood that her dark truth wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was the source of her strength. She hadn't become a killer that night. She had become a protector. Her father's death had been the first life taken by her weapon, but it had led to 25 lives saved by that same weapon. The file folder no longer seemed like evidence of her guilt, but proof of her transformation. Sarah Martinez had been born from the ashes of Sarah Thompson's trauma, and every person she had saved was a testament to her mother's faith in her daughter's character. Her dark truth wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her redemption. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would return to work the next day as Officer Martinez, but she would no longer carry the burden of her secret alone. Pine Valley deserved to know who their guardian angel really was, and more importantly, Sarah deserved to stop running from the truth that had made her into the protector she had become. Sarah arrived at the police station the next morning with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The file folder was tucked securely in her patrol bag, but she was no longer afraid of its contents. During her sleepless night, she had made a decision that would require more courage than any dangerous situation she had ever faced. She was going to tell Captain Williams the truth about who she really was. The morning briefing proceeded normally, with Sarah's colleagues congratulating her on the elementary school incident and joking about her supernatural ability to diffuse dangerous situations. Mike Rodriguez clapped her on the shoulder, saying that she must have been born under a lucky star to have such perfect timing in crisis situations. If only he knew how close to the truth he really was. After the briefing, Sarah requested a private meeting with Captain Williams. As she sat once again in his office, she noticed that he looked different somehow, more relaxed, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The captain explained that the department's investigation into her background had been officially closed following her heroic actions at the school. Her record spoke for itself, he said, and Pine Valley was lucky to have her. Sarah took a deep breath and placed the file folder on the captain's desk. She told him that while he might not need answers about her past, she needed to give them anyway. Captain Williams looked surprised but leaned back in his chair, prepared to listen to whatever Sarah felt compelled to share. For the next hour, Sarah told her story in complete detail. She spoke about Marcus Thompson's years of abuse, about Linda Thompson's desperate attempts to protect her daughter, and about that terrible night when a 14-year-old girl had been forced to make an impossible choice. She explained how she had changed her name, moved across the country, and dedicated her life to becoming the kind of officer who could protect others the way no one had protected her family. Captain Williams listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as the story unfolded. When Sarah finished speaking, she sat quietly, waiting for judgment, condemnation, or at the very least questions about her mental fitness for duty. Instead, the captain reached across his desk and gently closed the file folder. The captain's response surprised Sarah completely. He told her that her past didn't disqualify her from being a police officer. It explained why she was such an exceptional one. Her ability to read dangerous situations, to remain calm under pressure, and to connect with both victims and perpetrators came from her lived experience with violence and trauma. Pine Valley hadn't just gained a skilled officer when they hired her. They had gained someone who truly understood what it meant to need protection. But Captain Williams also expressed concern for Sarah's well-being. He asked if she had ever received counseling for her childhood trauma and the shooting that had changed her life. Sarah admitted that she had avoided therapy, afraid that talking about her past might somehow compromise the new identity she had built for herself. The captain made a request that was both professional and personal. He asked Sarah to consider speaking with the department's counselor, not as a condition of her employment but as a friend who was concerned about her mental health. Carrying the weight of such traumatic experiences alone was unsustainable, he said, and Sarah deserved to find peace with her past. That afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in the office of Dr. Patricia Hayes, the department's psychological counselor. Dr. Hayes was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Sarah at ease. For the first time in 15 years, Sarah spoke openly about her childhood, her parents' relationship, and the night that had forced her to grow up instantly. Dr. Hayes listened with professional compassion, occasionally asking questions that helped Sarah explore feelings she had long suppressed. The counselor explained that Sarah's story wasn't uncommon among law enforcement officers. Many people were drawn to protective careers because of their own experiences with violence or trauma. What was remarkable, Dr. Hayes said, was how Sarah had channeled her pain into a force for good. The therapy session revealed something Sarah hadn't expected. Her guilt about her father's death had been compounded by a secret fear that she might have inherited his capacity for violence. Every time she drew her weapon, part of her worried that she might lose control the way Marcus Thompson had lost control so many nights of her childhood. Dr. Hayes helped Sarah understand that the circumstances of her father's death proved exactly the opposite. Even as a terrified 14-year-old, Sarah had used violence only as a last resort to protect someone else. Her restraint and precision in dangerous situations as an adult officer demonstrated that she had broken the cycle of violence that had defined her early life. Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her therapy sessions while maintaining her regular patrol duties. She found that talking about her past didn't make her weaker or more vulnerable. It actually made her more effective as an officer. Understanding her own motivations helped her better connect with victims of domestic violence and young people who had grown up in dangerous situations. The transformation wasn't lost on her colleagues. Mike Rodriguez commented that Sarah seemed different lately, more relaxed, more confident, and even more compassionate in her interactions with the community. He had no idea that she was finally learning to forgive herself for actions taken in desperation and fear. One evening, Sarah received a call about a domestic violence situation that felt eerily familiar. A young mother had barricaded herself and her 6-year-old daughter in a bathroom, while her abusive boyfriend tried to break down the door. As Sarah approached the house, she could hear the same sounds of rage and terror that had dominated her own childhood. This time, however, Sarah felt different as she prepared to confront the situation. Instead of relying purely on training and instinct, she drew upon the self-understanding she had gained through therapy. She knew exactly what the woman and child were experiencing because she had lived through it herself. The confrontation with the abusive boyfriend was swift and decisive. When he saw Sarah's uniform and weapon, he initially tried to claim that everything was fine, just as her own father had done so many times when police responded to their house. But Sarah could see through the lies because she had lived them herself. Using skills developed through both training and personal experience, Sarah managed to de-escalate the situation without violence. She spoke to the man about the cycle of abuse, about the choice he had to break that cycle or continue it, and about the lasting damage he was inflicting on the child who was listening to every word. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had been that terrified child. The boyfriend ultimately surrendered without incident, and Sarah was able to safely evacuate the mother and daughter. As she watched the little girl cling to her mother, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. This was case number 26, and it represented more than just another successful intervention. It was proof that her dark truth had been transformed into a source of light for others. Later that evening, as Sarah filled out the incident report, she realized that her story had come full circle. The frightened child who had once hidden behind furniture while her father raged had become the officer who now stood between other children and the same kind of terror. Her weapon had taken one life to save 2, and then had been used to save 26 more groups of people. Dr. Hayes had been right. Sarah's past wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be integrated into her identity as a protector. The skills she had learned during her traumatic childhood had been refined through training and experience, but their foundation remained the same, an absolute determination to prevent others from suffering the way she and her mother had suffered. As word of Sarah's latest success spread through the department, Captain Williams stopped by her desk to congratulate her. He mentioned that the department was considering her for a new position, training other officers in crisis intervention and domestic violence response. Her unique combination of professional expertise and personal experience made her an ideal candidate for helping other officers understand the complexities of family violence. Sarah accepted the opportunity without hesitation. Teaching other officers would mean sharing her story more broadly, but she was no longer afraid of the truth about her past. Her dark secret had become her greatest strength, and she wanted to use that strength to create better outcomes for families trapped in cycles of violence. The next few months brought changes to Sarah's life that she had never imagined possible. Her training seminars for other officers were highly regarded throughout the state, with departments from neighboring cities requesting her expertise. She spoke at conferences about the intersection of personal trauma and professional effectiveness, always emphasizing that healing from the past was essential for serving others in the present. Most importantly, Sarah had found peace with herself. The guilt that had haunted her for 15 years had been replaced by a quiet pride in the path she had chosen. Her mother's death had not been in vain if it had led to Sarah saving so many other lives. Her father's death, while tragic, had broken a cycle of violence that might have continued for generations. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the police station after conducting a training session on domestic violence intervention, she was approached by a young officer she didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself as Officer Jennifer Walsh from a neighboring department and explained that she had attended Sarah's seminar earlier that day. Officer Walsh told Sarah that the presentation had deeply affected her because she, too, was a survivor of childhood domestic violence. She had joined the police force for similar reasons, but had never spoken about her past with anyone. Sarah's courage in sharing her story had inspired her to seek the counseling she had been avoiding for years. As Sarah listened to Jennifer's story, she realized that her decision to be truthful about her past was creating ripple effects she had never anticipated. Other officers with similar backgrounds were finding the courage to address their own trauma, and the department as a whole was becoming more effective at handling domestic violence cases. The conversation with Officer Walsh continued late into the evening, with both women sharing experiences and insights about how their past traumas had shaped their approaches to police work. Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar role of mentor, offering guidance to someone who was just beginning the journey toward healing and self-acceptance. As they parted ways, Officer Walsh thanked Sarah for showing her that it was possible to transform pain into purpose. She said that Sarah's story had given her hope that her own difficult past could become a source of strength, rather than shame. The young officer's words stayed with Sarah long after she had driven home. That night, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since the day she first sat in Captain Williams's office with that unopened file folder. Her dark truth had indeed emerged, but rather than destroying her carefully constructed life, it had made that life more authentic and meaningful. She was no longer hiding from her past, but embracing it as an essential part of her identity, as a protector and healer. 2 years after Sarah's dark truth had emerged and been transformed into a source of strength, Pine Valley was preparing for an unprecedented event. The mayor had declared October 15th as Officer Martinez Day, in recognition of her service to the community and her innovative approach to law enforcement training. The ceremony would take place at Pine Valley Elementary School, the same location where she had negotiated the peaceful resolution of the active shooter situation. Sarah stood before her bathroom mirror that morning, adjusting her dress uniform one final time. The woman looking back at her was fundamentally different from the one who had lived in fear of discovery just 2 years earlier. Her eyes held a peace that came from self-acceptance, and her shoulders carried the confident posture of someone who had stopped running from her own truth. The elementary school gymnasium was packed with community members, fellow officers, and city officials. As Sarah walked to the podium to accept her commendation, she saw familiar faces throughout the crowd. Mrs. Chen was in the front row, beaming with pride. Captain Williams sat with the other department brass, his expression reflecting both professional pride and paternal affection. Dr. Hayes was there as well, offering a supportive smile that reminded Sarah of how far she had come in her healing journey. But the faces that meant the most to Sarah were those of the officers who had attended her training seminars over the past 2 years. She could see Officer Jennifer Walsh, who had since become a specialist in domestic violence intervention at her own department. There were dozens of other officers who had learned not just tactical skills from Sarah, but also the importance of addressing their own trauma in order to serve others effectively. As Sarah approached the microphone, she thought about the speech she had prepared. It was a standard acceptance speech filled with gratitude to the community and acknowledgement of her colleagues' support. But as she looked out at the crowd, she realized that this moment called for something more personal and honest. Sarah began by thanking the community for their trust and support, but then she departed from her prepared remarks. She told the crowd that she had a story to share, one that explained how she had developed the skills that had enabled her to protect so many people over the years. The gymnasium fell silent as Sarah began to speak about her childhood, her parents' troubled relationship, and the night that had changed everything. The audience listened in stunned silence as Sarah described growing up in a home marked by violence and fear. She spoke about her mother's love and courage, about her father's demons, and about the impossible choice she had been forced to make at 14 years old. Her voice remained steady as she explained how that traumatic experience had shaped her understanding of violence and her commitment to protecting others. Some people in the crowd were visibly moved to tears as Sarah described her years of hiding from her past and the guilt she had carried about her father's death. She spoke about how therapy and the support of her colleagues had helped her understand that her painful experiences could be transformed into a gift for others. Her weapon had taken one life in desperation and fear, but it had then been used to save countless others through courage and compassion. Sarah concluded her speech by addressing the young people in the audience. She told them that everyone carries some form of darkness or pain, but that darkness doesn't have to define their future. She urged them to seek help when they needed it, to speak their truth when they were ready, and to remember that their most difficult experiences could become their greatest sources of strength. The gymnasium erupted in applause as Sarah finished speaking, but she noticed that the ovation was different from typical ceremonial applause. This was the sound of a community that had been moved by authentic vulnerability and inspired by the transformation of pain into purpose. People weren't just acknowledging her professional achievements. They were celebrating her courage and sharing her most difficult truth. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by dozens of community members who wanted to thank her for her honesty and bravery. Parents spoke about how her story had helped them understand their own children's struggles. Young people thanked her for showing them that their past mistakes or traumas didn't have to limit their future possibilities. One conversation that particularly touched Sarah was with a teenage girl who had been in the elementary school library during the shooting incident 2 years earlier. The girl, now 16, told Sarah that she had been struggling with depression and thoughts of self-harm since that day. Hearing Sarah's speech had helped her understand that traumatic experiences could be survived and even transformed into sources of strength. The girl asked Sarah if she would be willing to speak at the high school about mental health and resilience. Sarah agreed immediately, realizing that her story could continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her dark truth had become a beacon of hope for others who were struggling with their own difficult pasts. As the crowd began to disperse, Mike Rodriguez approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. Her longtime partner told her that he finally understood why she had always been so good at reading dangerous situations and connecting with victims. He apologized for not recognizing the pain she had been carrying and expressed his admiration for her strength in sharing her story. Sarah smiled and told Mike that his friendship and support over the years had been part of her healing process, even if he hadn't known it at the time. The bonds she had formed with her colleagues had helped her learn to trust again, and their acceptance of her true story had completed her transformation from survivor to healer. Captain Williams was the last to approach Sarah as she prepared to leave the school. He handed her an envelope and told her to open it when she got home. Inside, Sarah later discovered, was a letter from the State Police Academy, inviting her to develop a statewide training program for officers dealing with domestic violence and trauma-informed policing. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment with her service weapon on the table beside her. It was the same gun that had saved 26 groups of people during her career in Pine Valley. But she understood now that its true power had never been in its ability to intimidate or harm. The weapon's real strength lay in the steady hands that held it, and the heart that guided those hands toward protection, rather than destruction. Sarah thought about her mother's letter, which she still kept in her bedside drawer. Linda Thompson had asked her daughter to forgive herself and use her experiences to help others who couldn't help themselves. Looking back on the past 2 years, Sarah realized she had finally fulfilled her mother's dying wish. The next morning brought news that would mark another milestone in Sarah's journey. A major publishing house had contacted her about writing a book about her experiences and her approach to trauma-informed policing. The opportunity would allow her to share her story with an even broader audience and potentially help officers and trauma survivors across the country. As Sarah considered the publisher's offer, she understood that accepting it would mean stepping fully into the light, leaving behind any remaining shadows from her past. Her dark truth had already emerged and been transformed, but now it could become a gift that reached far beyond the borders of Pine Valley. Sarah picked up her phone and called the publisher to accept their offer. As she spoke, she looked out her apartment window at the familiar streets of Pine Valley, the community that had embraced her both as Officer Martinez and as Sarah Thompson. Her journey from a frightened child, hiding from violence, to a healed adult protecting others from that same violence was complete. The girl who had once been forced to take a life to save lives had become a woman whose greatest weapon was her willingness to share her truth. Her story was no longer a dark secret to be hidden, but a gift from above to be shared with anyone who needed to know that their past pain could become their future strength. 26 successful cases had made her a local hero, but her courage in revealing her authentic self had made her something more. A beacon of hope for anyone struggling to transform their own darkness into light. Sarah's weapon would continue to protect people, but now it would be accompanied by an even more powerful tool, her voice speaking truth about trauma, healing, and the possibility of redemption for anyone brave enough to face their past and choose a different future.